welcome to another episode of Always Up to Date. I'm Denise and this is Yahweh, and we are co-owners of Always Bookkeeping. Today we are going to talk about employees versus contractors. And our quote today is from Michael Gerber, who's the author of the E-Myth. And the quote is, "If your business depends on you, you don't own a business, you have a job. And it's the worst job in the world because you're working for a lunatic." Our statistic that we like so much is 50% of all Canadian businesses will go out of business in the first 5 years. 23% of those businesses that have failed, the owners will list the inability to recruit and retain the right employees as a reason for their failure, making the inability to find the right team the third common reason for a business failing. We have these business owners that hire a contractor, and one contractor decides that she doesn't want to pay CPP for being self-employed and calls the CRA to request a CPP-EI ruling. The CRA rules that the contractor is actually an employee, and the business owner will have to pay for the payroll remittances for all the previous years that the contractor was ruled as an employee. Mm-hmm. So we see a lot of businesses that get into that problem. They don't see the difference between an employee and a contractor, and they just say, oh, they're contractors, so they don't have to pay. But there's very specific rules in what makes you an employee and what makes you a contractor. And so we're just going to look into that a little bit more. So Yahweh, can you tell us what the difference between a contractor and an employee is?
Well, on the main level, the contractor is somebody that's independent from your company, so they are able to work for somewhere else, do a job somewhere else, and be able to profit and gain a loss depending on their own personal business. Also, contractors, you don't have to withhold any CPP and EI or any tax from their pay. You just pay them for the rate that they set, and then that's it. For employees, you actually hire them to work for your business, and you have to withhold CPP and EI for them, and they're dependent on your supplies and the equipment from the business.
Right.
Yeah.
So why is it important to know if I've hired an employee or a contractor?
It's mainly because of the payroll remittances. Again, if you have an employee, there's going to be tax burdens for having an employee in your company, which is CPP, EI, and sometimes WCB, right? So those are the stuff, and you have to remit those to the CRA. Either monthly or quarterly or annually based on your remitting period. So it's important to know, because if you don't remit those and you actually have an employee, they are one of the most penalized out of all the tax remittances that we give to the government.
Yeah, I think we talked about that in another video, 20% a day.
Yeah,
which is a lot.
Yeah.
So what's the best thing to do to avoid a CPP or EI ruling?
Well, the first thing to do is to absolutely know that if you have an employee or a contractor, and there are specific factors that take into consideration with that. Just because you hired a contractor to work on a job doesn't mean that the CRA sees them that way. So you have to make sure that you have those factors to be considered whenever you hire somebody for a job. Yeah.
So how can the degree of control determine whether I have an employee or a contractor?
So a degree of control is who has control over what, right? So if you have a contractor, that means they have control of sometimes their schedule. They have control on what rates they want to charge you. They have control on what job they want to do, and not necessarily the employer's job to set out what needs to be done on those on those jobs. As opposed to when you have an employee, where a contract has been written out, or an employee contract, where you set their own wage rate, what their schedule is going to be, what tools they need to use for that specific job, what way of doing you need those jobs for. And sometimes there's always that gray area between those two, because especially when it comes to payment methods, sometimes it's agreed with both parties, or your way of doing the job, sometimes it's agreed between both parties. So that's when it becomes confusing, whether you have a contractor or you have an employee. Yeah.
So if I pay for the tools and equipment, can the worker still be considered as a contractor?
That's one of the factors that you want to consider. If the contractor has their own set of tools for them to do the job, it's more likely that the CRA would deem them as contractors, because they paid for the equipment, they paid for the tools that they use to do the job. So by doing that, if they if they incur a loss, or if they do gain a profit for doing the job, then it's going to be their own financial risk as a contractor, as opposed to an employee, where if you provide all of those equipments and tools, they don't necessarily have the financial risk that's going to be that they're going to be burdened for, right? For those tools and equipment. So that's another factor, tools and equipment. If you have a worker that you're supplying the tools for, they may be deemed as an employee, or as your employee.
Right.
Yeah.
So what happens if I let the worker hire an assistant?
That gives them control of how they want to get the job done, right? So if you hired an independent contractor and for some reason they can't do the job, and they're able to hire an assistant, that would be a bigger chance that the CRA would deem them as a contractor, because they see the control again, and the ability to have to gain profit or have loss based on who they hire, because that's their expense. If they hire an assistant and not necessarily yours, so that makes them a lot more independent and non-arm's length from your business. Yeah.
So how can financial risk determine if the worker is considered a contractor?
Again, if the worker has the ability to incur loss from doing the job, then they could be considered a contractor, because they will have their own expenses and they will not get reimbursed, as opposed to an employee, where you let's say they bought something, you need to reimburse them because it's part of your business and it's going to be your expense and not necessarily theirs. So that's another thing, or another factor that they consider, whether you have an employee or a contractor, is whether if they can if they have a financial risk on the job that they do. And again, if you're not the only customer that they have, and they can potentially get a loss from another another customer, then that deems them as independent from your corporation, and a little bit more likely to be deemed as a contractor.
So how does the opportunity of profit help the employee or contractor determination?
Again, it's the same thing. It's a financial risk. If they gain a profit on what they did for you, that means they put in the expenses to get those to get the job from you, and they're going to be deemed as independent from your business and not necessarily an employee. The employee wouldn't get any profit from hiring you, because they get a paycheck. So That's another thing that is considered when they're judging towards an employee or a contractor scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are all things that we talked about, like the degree of control, who buys the tools and equipment, who owns those tools and equipment,
Yeah.
Whether the employee or contract can hire an assistant, the financial risk and the opportunity for profit. Those are all things that the CRA is going to look at to determine whether you have a contractor or an employee. So we would strongly suggest that you make sure those are very clear when you hire someone.
Yeah.
Have an employment agreement or have a contractor agreement saying specifically who owns these tools. Do you need to use your own tools, or are we going to supply you the tools?
Yeah.
Is there a chance that you're going to make a profit from this job, or we're going to pay you this much and that's it?
Yeah.
We want you to have those really laid out clearly so that if you have a CPP or EI ruling from the CRA, you have it very clear what those are, because the worst case scenario, the CRA is going to determine it to be an employee when you've been paying them as a contractor. And like you said earlier, you're going to have to go back and pay all of those source deductions that you haven't been paying, which is a huge expense because you haven't been deducting them off the employee paycheck. And so you're responsible for those, not only the employer portion, but now you're responsible for the employee portion as well.
Yeah.
And you can ask the employee, but they are not required to pay those. It's your duty to take them off of their check, and so it's your responsibility. You're liable for those.
Yeah.
So Yahweh, what happens when I receive a CPP or EI ruling from the CRA?
So normally they'd ask you questions to they'll give you a questionnaire, trying to identify those factors in a different way. For example, they're gonna ask, they're gonna test controls just to see who sets the rate, or if they need your approval to do a certain job, because that determines the control. If they are allowed to hire their assistant, who owns the tools and equipment. So those are the stuff that they want to look at, and normally they would interview the employee or the worker first before they go to you, so they would have the idea of what the situation is before you get there. So it's very important that you isolate and make sure that the CRA, the employee, and you are, the CRA is receiving the same information from you and the employee.
Yeah.
And sometimes it gets ugly because from our story, it's gonna be a contractor that would wanna wish that they would be deemed an employee because they're sick of paying the CPP.
Yeah, that's right.
When you're the only one that they're working for, right?
That's
so they have that huge advantage. But if you set it out and say, okay, like this is we are the only customer at the moment, but she is allowed to work somewhere else and do the same services to other people, or we never provided her tools to begin with, and she sets her own schedule. Those are the stuff that could help you determine that they are a contractor and help you with the CRA to rule on your behalf that you have a contractor. Yeah.
So what happens if I don't agree with the decision the CRA has made? Can I file an appeal?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you don't, you don't want to be in that position, but if it happens, worst case scenario, you do have 90 days after they notified you. So you do have 90 days and set up an appeal, and I believe they will open another file and do another ruling to see what your angle is on what you don't agree on, based on the ruling that was given to you the first time. Yeah. So I think that's all the questions we have today. I hope you guys like our videos. If you do, please click like and subscribe. If you have some information that you want, or sorry, subject that you want us to talk about, please comment down below, and we'll see you guys next time on our next episode for Always Up to Date.